Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There are figures in history, towering intellects, enigmatic leaders, whispered prophets, whose impact seems to far exceed the circumstances of their time. Their presence disrupts chronology, their charisma distorts memory, and their innovations appear, in retrospect, almost unearned. In this investigation, we turn our gaze toward a hypothesis that would be dismissed out of hand by conventional historians, yet continues to haunt the edges of literature, folklore, and speculative philosophy, that some of these figures were not human at all, but masks, deliberate disguises, worn by an entity known only through fiction as NYARLATHOTEP. First described by H.P. Lovecraft in 1920, NYARLATHOTEP occupies a unique position in the mythology of cosmic horror. Unlike the vast and indifferent old ones, he is personable, mobile, and disturbingly present. He does not destroy by force, but by seduction, offering ideas, technologies, or dreams that crumble civilizations from within. What makes him singular is this: he appears in history not as metaphor, but as participant, supposedly. This documentary does not set out to prove that NYARLATHOTEP walked the earth. Rather, it examines the literary structure, psychological necessity, and cultural resonance of believing that he might have. Through historical analysis, mythological parallels, and close literary reading, we will explore how certain human lives have been retroactively interpreted as masks of this crawling chaos. Consider carefully. If even one such life aligns too closely with the myth, what does that imply about history itself? By listening, by even entertaining the question, you have already joined the inquiry. The consequences, as always, remain unclear. The figure of NYARLATHOTEP first emerged not from ancient myth or occult tradition, but from the troubled imagination of a man deeply attuned to the psychological tremors of his age. In 1920, amidst the cultural disintegration that followed World War I, Howard Phillips Lovecraft wrote a short prose poem titled NYARLATHOTEP. It was unlike anything else in his oeuvre to that point, cryptic, apocalyptic, and steeped in the imagery of a collapsing modernity. The titular figure appeared not as a beast or a demon, but as a wandering human, offering strange instruments and drawing crowds into states of ecstatic ruin. Lovecraft claimed the concept came to him in a dream, a statement worth noting given his lifelong fascination with the porous boundary between sleep and reality. But this dream did not arise in a vacuum. It crystallized a convergence of cultural anxiety, scientific disillusionment, and literary ambition. The post-war world, fractured and uncertain, seemed ready for a prophet. But what if that prophet was not a savior, but a herald of chaos? In constructing NYARLATHOTEP, Lovecraft inverted the tropes of both science fiction and religious revelation. Where traditional messiahs offer clarity, NYARLATHOTEP offers only spectacle and breakdown. Where alien beings in early pulp fiction arrived in metallic crafts, this figure arrived alone, by foot, dressed in the garb of the contemporary world. His power lay not in otherworldly appearance, but in an unsettling familiarity. The crowds who witnessed him, willingly, even eagerly, were not abducted but enchanted. This inversion matters. It is not simply a monster tale, but a philosophical intervention, a thought experiment about how easily civilization can be turned against itself through one charismatic operator. Consider carefully. This was not an alien invader from outside, but a corrupter from within who used our own tools our own desires to seed collapse. The unsettling implication is that apocalypse may arrive not with force, but with persuasion. Lovecraft was no stranger to feelings of alienation and decay. A product of New England aristocracy in decline, he watched the values of his heritage erode under the pressures of industrialization, immigration, and secular modernity. He harbored a profound distrust of mass movements, technological spectacle, and charismatic figures, fears that coalesced in his portrayal of NYARLATHOTEP. The 1920s were, after all, a period of burgeoning mass communication, with radio and cinema transforming the ways in which individuals could influence the collective. Figures like Nikola Tesla, Aleister Crowley, and even political demagogues seemed to Lovecraft like harbingers of a new form of power, spectacle without substance, revelation without reason. It is not coincidence that NYARLATHOTEP is first introduced as a traveling showman, evoking both vaudeville and revival tent. He arrives not to destroy cities, but to fill auditoriums. His danger lies not in violence, but in willing audience. We must pause here to recognize what this suggests about Lovecraft's creator intent. NYARLATHOTEP is not merely a fictional character, he is a philosophical provocation. He distills Lovecraft's core anxieties into a single, mobile figure, history's saboteur, dressed in modern clothes. He personifies the fear that reason will not save us, that the very structures we believe will deliver enlightenment can be co-opted to deliver ruin. In this light, NYARLATHOTEP becomes a cipher for mistrust in progress itself. This is not simply a critique of modernity, but a dramatization of its limits. And because he wears human form, he offers a disturbing possibility that we might mistake the end of knowledge for its pinnacle. His stories function as warnings, allegories of epistemic pride and collective delusion. What is striking is that Lovecraft, despite his materialist philosophy, constructed NYARLATHOTEP with theological precision. He is not omnipotent, but omnipresent, not divine, but worshipped, not eternal, but timeless. These paradoxes place him within a long tradition of the wandering adversary, archetype, a figure found in apocalyptic literature, Gnostic heresies, and esoteric lore. Yet Lovecraft gave this archetype a distinctly modern form. NYARLATHOTEP moves through the early 20th century, not as myth, but as metaphor embodied, visible in crowds, lectures, laboratories. He is less a being than a function of civilization at its most vulnerable. As such, he opens a thematic space for interpreting history through a horror lens, not as a series of accidents or heroic progressions, but as a manipulated narrative, guided by intelligences with motives utterly unlike our own. It is not simply that NYARLATHOTEP appears in stories set in the modern world. It is that he needs modernity in order to work. Without our faith in progress, his seductions would fail. This framing has proven remarkably persistent. Later authors, scholars, and readers have retrofitted real historical figures into the NYARLATHOTEP mold, often unconsciously. Visionaries who appear out of nowhere, who disrupt entire paradigms, who speak in riddles and vanish mysteriously, they attract speculation. Did Lovecraft intend this interpretive flexibility? Perhaps not explicitly, but he embedded in NYARLATHOTEP the qualities that invite it: polymorphism, charisma, and an ambiguous relationship to time. The character becomes a framework for suspicion, an invitation to question which parts of history feel too advanced, too sudden, or too well orchestrated. In this way, Lovecraft inadvertently created a vessel into which generations could pour their fears about influence, identity, and manipulation. The figure's utility lies precisely in his uncertainty. Indeed, it is the ambiguity of NYARLATHOTEP, his refusal to resolve into a single identity, that gives him enduring philosophical weight. He is not a villain in the traditional sense, but an interpretive black hole. The more closely one examines him, the less stable the surrounding narrative becomes. This, too, may have been part of Lovecraft's intent. In an age where knowledge was expanding faster than comprehension, where new theories could undo centuries of belief overnight, NYARLATHOTEP emerges as the anthropomorphic echo of our epistemic instability. He is not the destroyer of civilizations. He is the trigger, the whispered idea, the cryptic invention, the impassive smile that tips societies into self-destruction. That he is human-shaped is not a trick of horror, but a thesis that humanity itself is the perfect mask for the inhuman. Long before H.P. Lovecraft gave NYARLATHOTEP a name, the archetype he embodies had already been haunting cultural memory for millennia. The image of a charismatic wanderer who arrives in times of upheaval, offering riddles, gifts, or insight that prove corrosive, appears across mythologies, religious texts, and esoteric traditions. These figures are rarely straightforward villains. Instead, they act as destabilizing agents, intermediaries between the known and the unknowable. They wear many faces: the trickster, the tempter, the teacher, the deceiver. Each iteration contributes something to the eventual literary construction of NYARLATHOTEP, who seems less like a singular invention than a condensation of many ancient suspicions. His power lies not just in his actions, but in his lineage, his mythic resonance. One of the most enduring antecedents is the trickster god, a cultural fixture from West Africa to the Arctic. Figures such as Eshu in Yoruba mythology, Loki in Norse tradition, and Coyote among Native American peoples embody a chaotic intelligence that disrupts order while claiming no clear allegiance. They do not destroy directly, but provoke destruction through manipulation, inversion, and taboo. Eshu, for instance, famously places a hat with different colors on each side and walks between two farmers, inciting a violent dispute when each insists on what they've seen. This act does not just reflect mischief, it reveals a fundamental instability in perception. NYARLATHOTEP operates similarly, not by force, but by orchestrating the collapse of shared reality. The resonance is striking. Both figures exploit ambiguity to erode certainty, and in doing so, unveil the fragile foundations of civilization. Another relevant archetype comes from the Gnostic traditions of the first few centuries CE, particularly the concept of the false revealer. In these cosmologies, the world is ruled by a blind creator, the demiurge, whose illusions maintain control over human souls. Occasionally, a being from beyond the veil, often appearing human, enters this world to awaken or deceive. While some revealer figures are benevolent, others serve darker aims, mimicking divine truth, only to lead followers deeper into error. We must recognize how closely NYARLATHOTEP mirrors this logic. He claims knowledge, demonstrates impossible insight, and invites the crowd into ecstasy or madness. He becomes, in essence, the anti-redeemer, not one who saves the world, but one who reveals it was never real to begin with. This reveals a profound metaphysical threat. If the structure of reality can be overwritten by such a figure, then what does that say about our own epistemic foundations? In medieval folklore, especially throughout Europe and the Islamic world, we encounter recurring legends of wandering strangers who appear just before catastrophe. These visitors are described as oddly dressed, unnaturally calm, or unsettlingly articulate. They speak in parables, offer miraculous tools, or warn of coming collapse, only to vanish without trace. Some tales identify them with prophets or angels in disguise. Others mark them as demons, jinn, or devilish tempters. The ambiguity is consistent. Such figures defy moral categorization and evade historical fixation. Notably, many accounts describe them arriving from the east or out of the desert, locations symbolically tied to spiritual testing and forbidden wisdom. Lovecraft's Egyptian framing of NYARLATHOTEP draws heavily from this imagery, though he often insisted his knowledge of the Middle East was superficial. The trope of the desert-born emissary of ruin is central to the character's presence. Compare this now to Renaissance occultism, where a flurry of interest in ancient knowledge led to the emergence of figures like Hermes Trismegistus, John Dee, and Faust. These were men who claimed, or were believed, to traffic with inhuman intelligences in pursuit of hidden truths. Their stories often end in downfall, madness, or disappearance. NYARLATHOTEP fits seamlessly into this milieu, not as a participant, but as an origin. Imagine a being who offers Enochian scripts, alchemical breakthroughs, or impossible diagrams not as stolen wisdom, but as calculated sabotage. In this reading, the Faustian bargain becomes a kind of cosmic trap. What if the being granting forbidden knowledge was not malevolent, but simply curious about how quickly we would destroy ourselves with it? It is not simply that NYARLATHOTEP gives knowledge too early. It is that he does so strategically, to watch systems fail under the weight of their own acceleration. There is also a philosophical strain to consider. Enlightenment anxieties about the limits of reason. During the 18th century, thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and later Kant grappled with the tension between the pursuit of knowledge and the destabilizing effects of discovery. The more we learn, the more fragile our systems of understanding become. By the 19th century, with Darwin's evolutionary theory and Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God, this tension became existential. Lovecraft was writing in the aftermath of this philosophical crisis. NYARLATHOTEP then becomes a characterization of entropy disguised as genius, an embodiment of what happens when epistemology reaches its breaking point. He is not simply a corrupter of minds, but a test of whether the human mind can endure the full weight of its own curiosity. This is a legacy of Enlightenment thinking, the idea that knowledge, once unmoored from moral structure, may become indistinguishable from destruction. Consider carefully. What makes NYARLATHOTEP endure is not his power, but his plausibility. He aligns too closely with figures we already fear, already suspect. The world has always contained those who move between disciplines, who arrive unannounced, who leave transformation in their wake. Whether in the form of magicians, prophets, polymaths, or charlatans, these individuals carry the unsettling aura of having seen something we have not. NYARLATHOTEP amplifies that aura, distilling centuries of suspicion into a single narrative vector. He is not simply a god wearing a mask, but a mask that has learned to become godlike through repetition across cultures. We must recognize that his literary construction is not additive, but syncretic. He succeeds not by inventing a new archetype, but by absorbing all existing ones into himself. Among all the entities in Lovecraft's mythos, NYARLATHOTEP possesses perhaps the most linguistically distinct name, elaborate, serpentine, and resistant to clear translation. Unlike names such as Cthulhu or Azathoth, which suggest inhuman phonemes and primordial noise, Nyarlathotep's name invites linguistic analysis. It hovers at the edge of recognizability, suggesting a hidden system of references, a composite of ancient languages, or an intentional corruption of real titles. For readers and scholars, this singular name operates not merely as a label, but as an encoded artifact. Its phonetic structure, cultural overtones, and mythic rhythm together generate a kind of ritual resonance. And like any symbol too carefully constructed, it implies that its creator, or the force behind it, intended it to be remembered. The name first appeared in Lovecraft's 1920 prose poem, Nyarlathotep, and, as he described in his letters, it came to him, in a dream so vivid I could not shake it. While dreams are not trustworthy etymologies, they are revealing windows into how symbols behave in the unconscious mind. The structure of the name, Nyarlathotep, has an unmistakable cadence, one that echoes ancient Egyptian titulary and esoteric chants. Lovecraft, though largely self-taught and often disdainful of organized scholarship, had a lifelong fascination with ancient cultures. Egypt, with its tombs, dynasties, and cryptic gods, offered an alluring backdrop for a being who is at once historical and utterly alien. The final syllable, tep, is particularly evocative. It mirrors names like Imhotep, Ptahhotep, and Amenhotep, suggesting priesthood, power, and proximity to divine authority. But unlike these historic figures, Nyarlathotep's name destabilizes rather than affirms history. It reads as a corrupted theonym, a counterfeit divinity. We must recognize that Lovecraft's use of such naming was not random, but thematic. The choice of an Egyptian-sounding name for a shape-shifting entity with human form links it to long-standing traditions of masked gods and unknowable rulers. Egypt, in the Western imagination of Lovecraft's time, was not simply an archaeological site. It was a symbolic origin of mystery, death, and lost knowledge. The name Nyarlathotep, then, becomes a sigil of esoteric displacement. It sounds like it belongs in the archaeological record, but does not. It is familiar, but unverifiable. This reveals the name's central function. It operates as a linguistic intrusion, suggesting a presence that has always been here, yet evading direct citation. When uttered, it carries with it the discomfort of déjà vu, an uncanny recognition that bypasses logic. In symbolic language, names are never inert. They act as containers for archetypes, narrative expectations, and emotional resonances. Nyarlathotep's name is a spell in the oldest sense of the word, not a command, but a recitation that alters perception. Its very pronunciation destabilizes the line between fiction and myth. Scholars have noted its similarity to the structure of magical incantations in ancient and modern grimoires, polysyllabic, rhythmically complex, and open-ended in interpretation. Compare it to names found in the Key of Solomon or later in Aleister Crowley's Liber al-Vel Legis, where names like Iwas or Abrahadabra function not as identifiers, but as gateways. In this light, Nyarlathotep becomes less a name for an entity and more a linguistic signature, a semantic mask behind which chaos speaks. This mask is reinforced through recurring symbols in Lovecraft's descriptions. Nyarlathotep is associated with a variety of forms: dark pharaoh, shifting masks, or the faceless god. But certain images return consistently: desert landscapes, strangely advanced instruments, and crowds enthralled by language they do not fully understand. These symbols serve a dual function. They identify the character within the narrative, but they also mirror the experience of reading NYARLATHOTEP. Just as his audience is hypnotized by his displays, readers are drawn into texts that withhold clarity. The symbol becomes self-referential. NYARLATHOTEP is the symbol of symbols, the performance of meaning without meaning. He embodies what philosopher Jean Baudrillard might call simulacrum, not a representation of reality, but a self-sustaining illusion. Rhetorically, Lovecraft frames the character with religious undertones that blur into psychological instability. Witnesses describe NYARLATHOTEP as both divine and demonic, enlightening and terrifying. In some texts, he is seen as the soul and messenger of the outer gods, implying a semiotic role. He represents higher entities, but also distorts their messages. This creates an epistemological crisis. If NYARLATHOTEP is the medium of communication from the cosmos, then the cosmos speaks in contradiction, ambiguity, and manipulation. Language itself becomes infected. The figure's symbolic function, then, is not to transmit knowledge, but to expose the failure of symbolic transmission. We do not learn from NYARLATHOTEP. We unlearn the assumption that knowledge is coherent. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's design. Where many horror writers focus on monstrous embodiment, claws, fangs, mutations, Lovecraft invests horror in semiotics. NYARLATHOTEP is terrifying, not because he destroys the body, but because he compromises the system through which we make sense of anything. His name, his voice, his image, all become containers for entropy. This is horror at the level of language, the fear that words no longer anchor us to reality, but unmoor us from it. And once that process begins, the self cannot remain intact. The linguistic instability of NYARLATHOTEP is not decorative, it is methodological. It serves as a vehicle for what we might call epistemic decay. We must pause here to consider a rhetorical question. What happens when a name uttered in fiction begins to behave like folklore? When it appears in graffiti, in forums, in dream journals, even in whispered schoolyard stories, has it crossed over from literary invention to living myth? The evidence, while anecdotal, is extensive. NYARLATHOTEP's name has been embedded into tabletop rituals, musical compositions, and internet conspiracy posts. Like other invented terms with mythic resonance, such as Necronomicon or Tesseract, his name now functions independent of Lovecraft. This triadic emergence, name, image, implication, means the symbol has taken root, not in truth, but in usability. As with any occult term, its power lies in repetition, in rumor, in resistance to singular meaning. The most effective myths are not those which announce themselves as fiction, but those that disguise themselves in the vestments of historical truth. In the case of NYARLATHOTEP, Lovecraft's success lies not only in the horror of the character itself, but in the structural plausibility of his presence. From his first appearance, NYARLATHOTEP is framed not as an incomprehensible cosmic being, but as an enigmatic figure within the world, someone real people see, follow, and try to understand. This decision marks a deliberate shift from abstract monstrosities to narrative intrusion. Myth becomes more than metaphor. It becomes speculation dressed as documentary. Through this method, Lovecraft created a space in which readers are compelled to ask, what if this really happened? And more disturbingly, what if it already did? The structural tools used to manufacture this plausibility are familiar to scholars of apocryphal texts, pseudo-histories, and speculative anthropology. Lovecraft draws upon the language of eyewitness testimony, the format of journal entries, and the tone of academic report to construct what appears, at times, to be a found account rather than a tale. In NYARLATHOTEP, the narrator speaks in first-person plural. We followed him. We saw the things he showed us. This creates a shared memory structure that mimics oral history. The collective voice implies consensus, and consensus, even fictional, invites credibility. It is not simply a story being told, it is a memory being shared. In doing so, Lovecraft situates NYARLATHOTEP within a framework that readers unconsciously associate with historical recounting, not fantasy. This approach builds upon techniques seen in earlier Gothic and scientific romances. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein begins with letters. Bram Stoker's Dracula unfolds through journal entries, telegrams, and newspaper clippings. These framing devices serve a singular purpose: to blur the boundary between fiction and the archival. Lovecraft inherits this tradition, but with an important shift. His goal is not to humanize the supernatural, but to document its corruption of human understanding. The characters in his stories do not learn how to defeat NYARLATHOTEP. They merely record the fact that they encountered something beyond all known categories. This passivity enhances authenticity. Real historical documents do not contain narrative arcs. They contain fragments, inconsistencies, and unexplained phenomena. By imitating these imperfections, Lovecraft elevates his fiction to the level of mythical evidence. We must recognize that myth-building depends not on persuasion, but on resonance. NYARLATHOTEP resonates because he fits within a familiar set of expectations. The stranger who arrives with knowledge, the crowd that gathers, the collapse that follows. These narrative beats repeat across religious scripture, historical rumor, and apocalyptic literature. Whether it is the appearance of Hermes Trismegistus in Alexandria, the black man at Salem, or the wandering prophet of Revelation, there exists a persistent cultural motif of the sudden visitor who knows too much. Lovecraft, consciously or not, taps into this lineage. He does not need to convince the reader that NYARLATHOTEP is real. He need only suggest that the story sounds like something we already believe. Consider carefully. When a fictional entity behaves in ways that mirror our expectations of real historical figures, when it performs the same roles, causes the same effects, and generates the same rumors, what then separates fiction from cultural memory? This is the engine of narrative authenticity. Lovecraft's construction of NYARLATHOTEP is not an isolated literary act, but a parasitic narrative, a myth designed to inhabit other stories. Readers begin to wonder, could that real-world genius, that vanished prophet, that unexplained figure in the crowd, have been something more? NYARLATHOTEP becomes a retroactive explanation, a narrative virus that inserts itself into the margins of history. This process is amplified by the multiplicity of NYARLATHOTEP's forms. Unlike Cthulhu or Azathoth, whose appearances are singular and bounded by description, NYARLATHOTEP changes. He wears different masks, adopts different roles, and appears in divergent cultural contexts. This adaptability functions as both a narrative strategy and a mythic technique. It allows writers and later readers to graft the figure onto new timelines, new geographies, new ideologies. A 19th century alchemist, a Cold War scientist, a revolutionary speaker, each can be reinterpreted as a potential mask. In doing so, NYARLATHOTEP becomes not a static entity, but a framework for doubt. The more flexible he is, the more stories he can absorb. It is not simply a question of who is NYARLATHOTEP, but how many times have we seen him without knowing it? The power of myth lies in repetition, but not in redundancy. A successful myth repeats in form, not content. NYARLATHOTEP's many stories differ in detail, but share thematic signatures. The arrival, the display, the destabilization. This triadic structure echoes religious conversion narratives, initiation rites, and the arc of possession. The visitor does not just bring change, he brings reversal. Truth becomes doubt, clarity becomes madness, history becomes suspect. This structure, repeated across Lovecraft's stories and those of his literary descendants, reinforces the illusion that NYARLATHOTEP is not being invented, but rediscovered. The myth does not grow forward, it grows backward, inserting itself into gaps in the timeline. One final note must be made on the participatory nature of myth building. Lovecraft's readers, correspondents, and collaborators did not treat his work as closed fiction, but as open canon. Writers like August Derleth, Robert Bloch, and later Ramsey Campbell expanded the mythos through their own editions, treating NYARLATHOTEP as a shared cultural inheritance rather than an individual creation. This collective storytelling mirrors the way real myths evolve, not through singular authorship, but through iterative elaboration. Each version of NYARLATHOTEP, each new disguise, each new manifestation, adds not confusion, but texture. The more contradictory the accounts, the more plausible the myth becomes. For what is history, if not a set of disputed interpretations? Cosmic horror, as a genre, is not defined by what is seen, but by what is revealed too late. At its core lies a philosophical commitment to destabilization, of self, of reality, of meaning. Few entities embody this commitment as completely as NYARLATHOTEP, whose very presence serves to expose the unreliability of all human frameworks. To understand the full conceptual terror he represents, we must explore the three key ideas that define his narrative function: insignificance, entropy, and dream reality. These are not simply abstract themes. They are structural forces within the mythos, each one a philosophical abyss into which the reader is invited, not pushed. NYARLATHOTEP is not a monster to be fought, but a symptom of deeper truths. His existence implies not only that reality is vulnerable, but that its vulnerability is intentional. The concept of insignificance lies at the heart of Lovecraftian metaphysics. In a universe where elder gods drift aimlessly through endless voids, the human race becomes little more than background noise. But NYARLATHOTEP alters this dynamic in a profoundly unsettling way. Unlike Cthulhu, who dreams in silence beneath the sea, or Azathoth, who gibbers mindlessly at the center of chaos, NYARLATHOTEP notices us. He interacts, speaks, manipulates, and in doing so, he offers the cruelest twist of all, that our insignificance might itself be interesting to something beyond comprehension. Consider carefully, what if we are not ignored because we are too small, but observed because we are small and unstable? This is a shift from cosmic apathy to cosmic scrutiny, and scrutiny implies judgment, even if that judgment follows laws we will never understand. This shift is captured in the original prose poem NYARLATHOTEP, where the narrator recalls that we had not known that the towers had grown too high, and now they tremble and are ready to fall. The line suggests not divine punishment, but cosmic consequence. Our own hubris unwittingly triggers collapse. NYARLATHOTEP's arrival does not cause disaster, It coincides with it, as if responding to an internal weakness already present in our systems. His role becomes diagnostic. He exposes the hollowness of the structures we build, political, scientific, philosophical, by offering just enough knowledge to accelerate their decay. And that brings us to the second concept, entropy. Entropy, in this context, is not merely physical decay, but informational instability. In thermodynamics, entropy measures disorder. In NYARLATHOTEP's domain, it measures epistemic overload. He introduces devices, ideas, or visions that destabilize the cognitive balance of individuals and societies. What begins as awe quickly collapses into incomprehension. Consider the tale told in The Dreams in the Witch House, where non-Euclidean geometry and multi-dimensional travel become not breakthroughs, but psychological poisons. These stories do not argue that knowledge is forbidden. They suggest that knowledge, when introduced out of sequence, becomes lethal. It is not what NYARLATHOTEP shares that undoes his victims, but when and how he does so. We must pause here to recognize that entropy is not framed as evil, but inevitable. NYARLATHOTEP does not preach doom. He demonstrates it. He shows the crowd their future and lets them walk into it smiling. He spoke much of the sciences, the original prose poem tells us, and of electricity and psychology, and I felt that he knew terrible things. This triadic list, sciences, electricity, psychology, reveals a subtle pattern, external, structural, and internal domains of human progress, all contaminated by overreach. By connecting scientific discovery with emotional deterioration, Lovecraft suggests that entropy begins not in the material world, but in the mind. And once that erosion begins, reality becomes unstable. Or perhaps more accurately, we begin to see that it was always unstable. This leads us to the third and most haunting concept, dream reality. NYARLATHOTEP blurs the line between waking perception and dreaming distortion. He appears in dreams, induces hallucinations, and moves freely between mental states and material space. He is the entity most closely associated with the dreamlands, a realm in Lovecraft's mythos where subconscious thought shapes geography, physics, and even time. The boundary between dream and reality, already thin in Lovecraft's work, dissolves entirely around NYARLATHOTEP. His presence rewrites that boundary, and this poses a chilling philosophical implication. If we cannot distinguish between dream and waking world, then reality becomes a matter of consensus, not fact. This is not simply narrative texture. It is a core epistemological threat. In modern psychological terms, dream reality functions like a dissociative condition. When encountered with contradictions too vast to resolve, the mind invents a softer world. NYARLATHOTEP accelerates this process. His victims do not disbelieve him. They integrate him into new belief systems, cults, or delusions. The result is not mass terror, but mass conversion. This reveals one of Lovecraft's darkest insights, that the human mind will not reject the unreal. It will worship it if it seems more coherent than the truth. Under NYARLATHOTEP's influence, dream and reality collapse into performance. What matters is no longer what is real, but what feels real, what organizes the chaos, even if falsely. Not X, but Y. It is not that NYARLATHOTEP causes madness, but that he reveals madness as the default state, thinly covered by language and habit. His arrival does not break minds, it unmasks them. And what emerges is not always terror. Sometimes it is awe, sometimes surrender. In this way, he embodies a philosophical challenge that exceeds morality. He does not ask us to choose between good and evil, sanity and insanity, truth and illusion. He forces us to confront the fact that such binaries may be artificial. In the world he reveals, there is only exposure and denial. The mythos that surrounds NYARLATHOTEP is not populated by familiar monsters, nor structured like traditional pantheons. Rather, it consists of entities whose nature resists comprehension, beings defined not by personality, but by function, geometry, and effect. Among these are the outer gods, the great old ones, and the elusive denizens of the dreamlands. NYARLATHOTEP moves uniquely among them, not as a peer, but as an intermediary. He is, in Lovecraft's own terms, the soul and messenger of the outer gods. Yet this designation is as ambiguous as it is unsettling. It places him in close proximity to the most powerful entities in the mythos, while implying a disturbing intimacy between the human world and the unfathomable forces behind it. To understand NYARLATHOTEP is to map his relationships, not in terms of loyalty or hierarchy, but in terms of alignment and effect. The outer gods occupy the highest echelon of Lovecraft's cosmology. They are not gods in the mythological sense, but principles, vast, often formless forces that reflect the chaotic structure of reality. Azathoth, for instance, is a blind, idiotic god that pulses at the center of the universe, surrounded by piping flutes and gibbering servitors. It is entropy incarnate, creative force, stripped of will or awareness. Yog-Sothoth, another outer god, is described as coexistent with all time and space, a being of total knowledge, inaccessible to human perception. These entities do not act. They exist, and their mere presence deforms logic, space, and time. NYARLATHOTEP uniquely moves among them. He communicates, not because they speak, but because he translates their chaos into symbols the human mind can partially grasp, though never safely. This positioning raises a crucial question. If NYARLATHOTEP serves as a messenger, who is he speaking to? Not the outer gods. They do not require language. Not the other great old ones, such as Cthulhu, who slumber until conditions are right. The answer, unsettlingly, is that NYARLATHOTEP speaks to us. His role is not cosmic liaison, but epistemic conduit. Through dreams, hallucinations, and prophetic masquerades, he delivers insights that function like viral ideas, spreading across minds and societies, seeding collapse through understanding. We must pause here. The implications are profound. The universe, in Lovecraft's vision, is not silent. It communicates, but only through NYARLATHOTEP, and only in forms that guarantee misunderstanding. This communication is not direct. NYARLATHOTEP rarely reveals himself in his true form, if such a thing exists. Instead, he employs avatars, temporary and culturally specific manifestations designed to infiltrate different societies. The Dark Pharaoh is perhaps the most well-known, a mysterious figure from ancient Egypt, regal and terrible, presiding over forgotten cults and cryptic rites. In other tales, he appears as a modern scientist, a faceless figure in shifting robes, or even as an intangible presence in dreams. These avatars are not disguises in the human sense. They are narrative masks, contextual shapes that allow NYARLATHOTEP to interact with humans without overwhelming them. Each mask serves a different function: to instruct, to deceive, to guide, to unmake. But all masks share one quality: they leave their witnesses changed, often irrevocably. Consider the Dreamlands, a separate plane in Lovecraft's cosmology, accessible through sleep and populated by entities untethered to physical laws. In this realm, Nyarlathotep's influence is pervasive. He appears as a manipulator of kings, a tormentor of travelers, a subtle architect of madness. The dreamlands are not a refuge from the real world, but a precursor to it, a testing ground where ideas, forms, and identities are rehearsed before entering the waking world. If we accept this interpretation, then Nyarlathotep's avatars are not spontaneous inventions. They are dreamed first and only later imposed upon reality. This dynamic reframes our understanding of his interventions. He does not create masks arbitrarily. He perfects them in the realm of subconscious narrative before using them to fracture consensus reality. Other entities, though often subordinate to Nyarlathotep in narrative focus, reinforce his philosophical role. Consider the Haunter of the Dark, a being linked to Nyarlathotep through the artifact known as the Shining Trapezohedron. This object allows its possessor to summon the Haunter, but doing so results in obsession, madness, and ultimately death. The Haunter, in some interpretations, is yet another avatar, perhaps one used to bridge the gap between dream and waking destruction. The artifact becomes a ritual tool, a point of contact between human curiosity and cosmic consequence. That such tools exist implies a broader system, one in which Nyarlathotep has seeded the world with mechanisms of contact, each waiting for the right mind to activate it. We must consider the function of these entities not as characters, but as conceptual vectors. They are not agents in a plot, but distortions in a system. Their presence warps causality, language, and identity. Nyarlathotep does not control them in the traditional sense. Rather, he curates their appearances, orchestrating their interactions with humanity to produce maximum philosophical disruption. This role places him in tension with other cosmic beings. Cthulhu, for instance, is passive, dreaming until the stars align. Nyarlathotep is active. He is not waiting. He is already here. Not X, but Y. He is not an invader from beyond, but an infiltrator from within. His agency is not external. It is mimetic. This distinction is critical for understanding why Nyarlathotep appears so frequently and so variably. Unlike other mythos beings who remain distant, mythic, and largely passive, Nyarlathotep enters history. He wears its costumes, speaks its languages, manipulates its ideologies. Each appearance is culturally tailored, designed to resonate with the fears, hopes, and contradictions of its era. The avatars function not as disguises, but as expressions of context. In the industrial age, he is a scientist. In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh. In the age of dreams, a whisper. In all forms, he acts as a mediator between the unknowable and the tragically human. In Lovecraft's mythos, madness is not a deviation from reality. It is the inevitable result of seeing too much of it. Nowhere is this principle more intimately enacted than in human encounters with Nyarlathotep. Unlike other cosmic entities that remain aloof, hidden, or dormant, Nyarlathotep actively engages with humanity. He speaks, demonstrates, persuades. He does not simply appear, he performs. This unique proximity creates a paradox. While the outer gods annihilate through indifference, Nyarlathotep annihilates through attention. He listens, responds, and adapts. And in doing so, he reveals how fragile the human mind truly is, not when overwhelmed by force, but when confronted with comprehension. This direct engagement is depicted vividly in the original 1920 prose poem, Nyarlathotep, where the narrator describes witnessing a public demonstration of inexplicable devices and images. We saw things, he writes. which tied knots in the back parts of our brains. This metaphor of the mind knotted, not crushed, but twisted, is central to understanding the madness Nyarlathotep induces. It is not madness born of terror, but of misalignment. His victims are not driven insane by a monstrous form, but by the collapse of their frameworks for understanding. He replaces the familiar with the oiti, nearly familiar, concepts that imitate rationality just closely enough to make their wrongness unbearable. The horror lies not in the alien, but in the almost comprehensible. We must recognize that this style of madness mirrors real psychological phenomena, particularly in the fields of cognitive dissonance, liminality, and derealization. Nyarlathotep does not act like a traditional monster, but more like a philosophical pathogen. He inserts into the mind an idea or image that cannot be resolved. For some, this leads to ecstatic worship. For others, to dissociative collapse. In The Dreams in the Witch House, for example, exposure to non-Euclidean space and higher dimensional mathematics does not bring scientific breakthrough, but mental dissolution. The protagonist is not destroyed physically, but conceptually. He cannot hold his place in the universe because the universe no longer aligns with his inherited geometry. Nyarlathotep, though not named directly in that tale, exists as a conceptual sponsor, lurking behind every revelation that breaks the mind rather than enlightening it. This raises a critical distinction. Madness is not a side effect of Nyarlathotep's presence. It is his method. His avatars are often seductive, his knowledge captivating. The damage comes not from the horror of his form, but from the invitation to think differently. He does not demand belief. He offers clarity, and that clarity unravels the believer. This inversion is profound, not X, but Y. It is not belief in Nyarlathotep that causes madness, but belief in the world before he arrives. Once exposed to him, previous truths become incoherent. The human mind, which depends on continuity, reacts violently to the collapse of narrative logic. What results is not chaos, but a new and terrible order, a framework that makes sense only in dreams, delirium, or death. Consider carefully the mechanism of this madness. In The Haunter of the Dark, the protagonist becomes obsessed with a mysterious church and a stone artifact that enables contact with a being of dark power. The further he explores, the more he loses grip on his own perspective. His downfall is not abrupt, but incremental. This is how Nyarlathotep works, not through destruction, but through invitation. He invites attention, rewards curiosity, and then lets comprehension do the rest. The victim, always, participates in their own undoing. This reflects a deeper philosophical threat, that the pursuit of truth may lead not to freedom, but to collapse. The Enlightenment ideal that knowledge liberates is inverted. Under Nyarlathotep, knowledge ensnares, and yet, not all madness is despair. Some find in Nyarlathotep a kind of perverse clarity. Cults form around his avatars. Individuals who have glimpsed his true nature often become prophets of a new fractured cosmology. They are not mad in the traditional sense, but recalibrated. Their vision of reality no longer matches the consensus, but within their minds, it is perfectly coherent. This suggests that madness, as framed in Lovecraft's work, is not always dysfunction. It is differentiation. To see the world as Nyarlathotep does is not to lose one's mind, but to acquire a new one unmoored from anthropocentric values, from linear time, from spatial logic. It is a form of epistemic ascension, albeit one that isolates rather than uplifts. This explains why so many human responses to NYARLATHOTEP fall into a pattern of conversion. The mind, confronted with unbearable contradiction, does not always retreat. Sometimes it reshapes itself to accommodate the new data. This is not resilience, but surrender masked as revelation. We looked upon the city and knew we had been there before, writes the narrator in NYARLATHOTEP. The horror is not in the alien, but in the recognition. We have always been part of something we did not understand. NYARLATHOTEP merely exposes that truth, and in doing so, he renders previous lives, beliefs, and identities obsolete. We must pause here and ask a final question. Why does Lovecraft frame madness not as collapse, but as contact? The answer lies in his philosophy. In Lovecraftian horror, the mind is not protected by ignorance, but by scale. We survive because we see so little. NYARLATHOTEP compresses the incomprehensible into bite-sized symbols, images, phrases, devices, then offers them without warning. What follows is not destruction, but realignment. The mind cracks not from trauma, but from reorganization. This is the ultimate function of madness in his mythos, not a failure of the mind, but its violent adaptation to truths it should never have received. Among the many horrors Lovecraft seeded into the mythos, none are more insidious or more thematically central than the danger of knowing. In traditional horror, fear arises from what is hidden, but in Lovecraftian cosmicism, fear is born when what is hidden is revealed, and the mind realizes it was never prepared. Forbidden knowledge, therefore, is not knowledge barred by law or morality, but knowledge incompatible with the structure of human thought. NYARLATHOTEP is its most active courier. He does not merely possess truths too vast or too alien. He distributes them, disseminates them, and watches as the minds that receive them begin to rupture. If other mythos entities threaten through their presence, NYARLATHOTEP threatens through revelation. What he gives is not salvation. It is epistemic collapse. To frame this properly, we must first understand that forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's world is not hidden by design, but hidden by scale. It is not concealed like a secret. It is inaccessible because it contradicts the very scaffolding of human reason. When NYARLATHOTEP imparts this knowledge, through devices, dreams, or direct encounters, the result is not intellectual enrichment, but psychic erosion. He spoke much of the sciences, writes Lovecraft in the original NYARLATHOTEP prose poem, and of electricity and psychology, and yet those who heard him went silently back to their homes, hoping that they would not see him again. Why? Because what he offered was not madness as spectacle, but truth as contamination. The listeners glimpsed something beyond empirical comprehension, and it stayed with them. We must pause here and consider carefully. What if knowledge can act like a virus? Not X, but Y. Not merely dangerous content, but dangerous structure. In modern epistemology, we understand that knowledge systems have architecture, axioms, categories, hierarchies. NYARLATHOTEP destabilizes those architectures not by denying them, but by offering alternatives, subtly, persuasively, fatally. The forbidden texts in Lovecraft's mythos, the Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Eltdown shards, rarely describe monstrous acts. They describe reality, but in ways that contradict everything the reader believes about time, matter, or identity. This description, when internalized, collapses the frameworks that hold the self together. Forbidden knowledge does not kill the body. It unbinds the epistemic contract that makes perception coherent. NYARLATHOTEP, as distributor of these insights, acts with a deliberate rhythm. He does not overwhelm immediately. He introduces information in increments, calculated, contextual, recursive. His knowledge often takes the form of demonstrations, performances, or artifacts. The audience is not attacked, but allowed to learn. This is the cruelty. The knowledge is not forced, but invited. In The Dreams in the Witch House, the protagonist gradually assimilates non-Euclidean mathematics and discovers the reality of alternate dimensions. His studies are not condemned. They are encouraged by dreams, voices, invisible tutors. Only later does he realize that the knowledge he acquired was not abstract, but binding, a contractual cognition that tethered his mind to something beyond control. NYARLATHOTEP is never far from such events, even if unnamed. His signature is the same. Truth that corrodes. We must acknowledge that in Lovecraft's mythos, knowledge is causality. To know a thing is to be affected by it. This inverts the humanist ideal that understanding leads to mastery. Under NYARLATHOTEP's gaze, understanding leads to exposure, and exposure, whether to truths about the cosmos or about the self, triggers breakdown. The most merciful thing in the world, Lovecraft writes in The Call of Cthulhu, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. NYARLATHOTEP removes that mercy. He connects the contents, draws the lines, and shows what lies beneath. What appears is not evil, but structureless structure, a world operating without moral design, rational endpoint, or anthropocentric relevance. This is epistemic collapse, the loss not of facts, but of the ability to organize facts. Victims of NYARLATHOTEP often retain memory and cognition, but they lose orientation. They speak in paradoxes, see patterns that are not there, or worse, patterns that are there but mean nothing. In some cases, they join cults. In others, they wander into death. In still others, they write. The mythos is full of letters, journals, and final confessions, documents left by those who glimpsed something they could neither refute nor survive. These texts are not warnings, but echoes, resonant with the structure of the very knowledge that undid them. And yet, not all forbidden knowledge leads to collapse. Some individuals adapt. They become intermediaries, translators, high priests of the incomprehensible. They no longer operate within human logic, but function according to a logic learned from elsewhere. They are not insane by medical standards. They are epistemically converted. They have been restructured by the truths NYARLATHOTEP revealed. This triadic transformation, witness, collapse, conversion, is the character arc of many who encounter him. What changes is not their soul, but their filtering system. They now process the world differently. The result is often monstrous, but in their own words, their clarity is perfect. We must end this section by returning to the symbolic function of NYARLATHOTEP. He is not merely a messenger of the outer gods. He is the mechanism by which their truth enters the world. His avatars, artifacts, and utterances all serve a single purpose: to shorten the distance between comprehension and collapse. Forbidden knowledge is not his weapon, it is his medium. Through it, he dissolves the illusion that human understanding is sufficient. He does not destroy reason. He shows that reason, when overextended, devours itself. The first literary manifestation of NYARLATHOTEP was not a story in the traditional sense, but a prose poem, published in November 1920, bearing only his name, NYARLATHOTEP. This piece, brief and elliptical, functions as both an origin myth and a philosophical overture. Unlike later stories that embed NYARLATHOTEP within conventional narrative arcs, this debut appearance strips away plot, character, and closure. What remains is tone, dread without source, awe without direction, memory without certainty. Lovecraft claimed the name and concept came to him in a dream, and the resulting text reads as if it were dictated from the edge of a fevered vision. NYARLATHOTEP, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. These lines do not describe, they announce. The speaker is already unraveling, and the god is already inside the world. The narrative centers on a figure, NYARLATHOTEP, who arrives as a showman, traveling from city to city with strange instruments and terrifying demonstrations. People attend his exhibitions with skepticism, only to leave altered, broken, or worse. And where NYARLATHOTEP went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. The figure does not simply exhibit technological marvels, he induces ontological instability. The poem ends with the narrator describing a decaying world filled with blank faces, shifting stars, and crumbling time. The final images suggest not apocalypse in the dramatic sense, but something subtler, the slow leaking of reality into abstraction. What is remarkable here is not what NYARLATHOTEP does, but what he represents, the erosion of the real through ideas presented too vividly. From this point, NYARLATHOTEP's presence seeps through Lovecraft's corpus in indirect ways. He is rarely the central figure in subsequent stories, but he appears as a whispered name, a sinister suggestion, a silent witness to collapse. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, for example, NYARLATHOTEP is mentioned by name, but never seen directly. The story revolves around alien MyGo and their interest in extracting and preserving human brains. However, amidst the tale's techno-horror and cosmic indifference, the cults associated with NYARLATHOTEP appear as a shadow network, a human response to inhuman forces. This associative logic, tying NYARLATHOTEP to technology, secrecy, and fragmentation, reinforces the conceptual link first forged in the poem. He does not need to appear in the room. His name alone is sufficient to fray meaning. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written in 1926, but published posthumously in 1943, NYARLATHOTEP takes a more active and sinister role, appearing in the climactic sections as the manipulator of dream realities. The protagonist, Randolph Carter, seeks a mythical city he has seen in dreams, only to be led astray by the deceptive guidance of a mysterious figure, revealed to be NYARLATHOTEP in disguise. The crawling chaos, he who hath known the abysses of night. This line echoes the earlier poem, but adds something new: intentionality. NYARLATHOTEP here is not a mere force of entropy, but a conscious being who plots the spiritual misdirection of humans. His power is not brute destruction, but psychological misdirection, leading Carter toward annihilation masked as destiny. That he operates in dreams rather than waking life only deepens his horror. He is not content to disrupt reality. He controls the machinery of belief itself. We must pause here to reflect on the structural role NYARLATHOTEP plays in these early works. He is not bound to one setting, genre, or function. He is a narrative chameleon, capable of appearing in horror, fantasy, science fiction, and even allegory. This flexibility has significant implications for his mythic endurance. By refusing to tie him to a fixed cosmology or physical form, Lovecraft positioned NYARLATHOTEP as a kind of interstitial agent, able to move between stories and genres, connecting otherwise disjointed elements of the mythos. In this, he differs fundamentally from Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth, who are rooted in specific spaces, cults, or cosmological roles. Nyarlathotep is everywhere and nowhere, which is precisely why he continues to infect stories long after his name is dropped. Another significant appearance occurs in The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, which was the last major story Lovecraft completed before his death. While Nyarlathotep is again not physically present for most of the narrative, the titular haunter is strongly implied to be one of his avatars. The shining trapezohedron, a crystalline artifact capable of summoning the haunter, becomes the central object of obsession for the protagonist, Robert Blake. The haunter can only move in darkness, and Blake's curiosity, fed by dreams, research, and symbolic suggestions, leads him to initiate contact. The results are predictable and tragic. What stands out here is the layering of lore. Lovecraft constructs an occult lineage, a lost cult, and an artifact that all point backward toward Nyarlathotep. Once again, the being is not directly violent. He is summoned through knowledge. The process of seeking becomes the mechanism of destruction. We must recognize that each of these early stories contributes a different facet to Nyarlathotep's persona. The original poem presents him as a traveling showman and harbinger. Dream Quest casts him as deceiver and manipulator of souls. Whisperer surrounds him with technological horror and alien worship. Haunter links him to forbidden knowledge and dream-induced obsession. The common thread is not consistency of character, but consistency of effect. Wherever Nyarlathotep appears, human minds destabilize. Societies fracture. Perception becomes unreliable. And truth, once glimpsed, becomes the engine of ruin. This intertextual spread functions like a mythos contagion. Nyarlathotep's character is not built through biography or canon, but through recurrence and resonance. He emerges not as a person or monster, but as a pattern, one recognized across stories, eras, and literary tones. This mode of construction mirrors folklore more than fiction. In folklore, figures like the devil, the trickster, or the wandering Jew appear in different forms across time, never identical, always recognizable. Lovecraft's genius was to create a similar figure for a modern scientific age, a cosmic being whose horror lies not in claws or curses, but in ideas that cannot be unthought. When Lovecraft introduced Nyarlathotep in 1920, he did so not through a traditional short story, but via a prose poem, a hybrid form that invites ambiguity, resists closure, and reflects the dreamlike quality of its subject. The piece, titled simply Nyarlathotep, stands as a foundational text within both the mythos and Lovecraft's literary development. It is brief, under 200 words, yet remarkably dense, functioning not as a narrative, but as a visionary episode. This story is not about what happens, but about how perception unravels in the presence of something incompatible with reason. Its brevity belies its ambition. The poem marks the precise moment where cosmic horror ceases to be symbolic and begins to suggest that the universe, as we know it, has already been infiltrated. The text begins with an invocation. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. This sentence is disorienting in both tone and structure. It blends personal voice, mythic proclamation, and void-facing nihilism. We must pause here to consider carefully the effect of this opening. The narrator does not introduce NYARLATHOTEP as a legend or monster, but as an ongoing event. The phrase, "I am the last," implies the speaker is a remnant of a world undone, already altered by the encounter. The subsequent narrative unfolds not as a linear plot, but as a deteriorating memory, one whose details are slipping even as they are recounted. This structure allows Lovecraft to emphasize epistemic decay as both content and form. In the story itself, NYARLATHOTEP arrives in a modern, unnamed city, one recognizably of the early 20th century, and stages a kind of lecture or demonstration. He came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. Here we see the Egyptian motif, introduced not as exotic window dressing, but as a symbolic anchor. Egypt, in Western esoteric tradition, represents hidden knowledge, lost ages, and spiritual authority. Yet Lovecraft inverts this symbolism. NYARLATHOTEP's pharaonic guise is not benevolent or sacred. It is haunted. His knowledge is not salvific, but corrosive. He carries instruments of glass and metal that produce strange visions, and those who witness them leave the theater altered, unmoored. Through the staleness and the clamor of a damp winter night, I heard the voice of the swarm, but it was the swarm of dead and moaning creatures. The presentation itself defies comprehension. The narrator and the crowd see images of cities dissolving, stars misaligning, and otherworldly landscapes. But Lovecraft avoids specific visual description. This absence is key. The horror lies not in what is shown, but in what cannot be reconciled with human perception. NYARLATHOTEP's performance acts like a virus, a set of images that infiltrate memory and perception, reconfiguring the audience's sense of reality. After the demonstration, the narrator wanders into the night, separated from his companions. He finds himself in a world subtly altered. Streets no longer led where they once did. Buildings loom with alien angles. Silence becomes oppressive. The story ends not with death, but with transposition. The narrator has entered another state of being, one whose laws he cannot name. We must recognize that NYARLATHOTEP is not merely a story, it is a literary mechanism. Lovecraft constructs the narrative like a ritual. The figure of NYARLATHOTEP appears, performs, and departs, but the effect lingers. The story enacts the very process it describes. The reader, like the narrator, is shown fragments of something incomprehensible and must confront the insufficiency of their interpretive tools. The story's lack of resolution is not a flaw, but a feature. It is not a closed loop, but an open system designed to be entered and re-entered with new levels of dread. Thematically, the story engages three major currents of early 20th century anxiety: technological spectacle, mass psychology, and the limits of human understanding. NYARLATHOTEP's demonstrations echo contemporary concerns about science outpacing ethics, particularly in the wake of World War I and the horrors of industrialized warfare. The glass and metal instruments evoke cinema projectors, early electrical machines, and devices like the Tesla coil, all technologies that inspired awe and fear in Lovecraft's time. Yet NYARLATHOTEP does not use these devices to entertain or enlighten. He uses them to destabilize. This reflects a deeper fear that scientific progress might not culminate in utopia, but in disintegration. In addition, the poem touches on collective psychosis. The crowds who attend NYARLATHOTEP's presentations do so willingly, even eagerly. And I remember that we went under the great arch, and I felt the touch of the black wings of madness. This collective madness is not imposed from outside. It emerges from within the audience as their shared assumptions begin to dissolve. Here, Lovecraft anticipates the terrifying power of mass movements, propaganda, and charismatic figures, forces that would soon dominate the political landscape of the 1930s. NYARLATHOTEP is not simply a bringer of knowledge, but a conductor of social entropy. He aligns perfectly with whatever fears a society already harbors, then magnifies them until collapse becomes inevitable. Finally, we must address the story's role in the larger mythos. Though NYARLATHOTEP predates most of Lovecraft's major works, it introduces several core concepts: the fragility of reality, the insufficiency of the senses, and the idea of a conscious cosmic force that wants us to understand just enough to fall apart. Later stories would expand these themes, but the original prose poem remains the primal seed. It is not a mythos entry point. It is the mythos in embryonic form. Published in December 1936, just 3 months before Lovecraft's death, The Haunter of the Dark stands as a chilling capstone to his mythos fiction and a significant rearticulation of NYARLATHOTEP's enduring menace. This story, unlike the earlier prose poem NYARLATHOTEP, does not center on the crawling chaos directly. Instead, it portrays his influence obliquely, filtered through a mysterious artifact, a forbidden church, and the mental deterioration of a single protagonist. Yet despite this narrative distance, the story remains one of the most precise illustrations of NYARLATHOTEP's evolving function in the mythos, a cosmic intermediary who requires no physical presence to enact devastation, only the suggestion of revelation. The protagonist, Robert Blake, is a writer and seeker of arcane truths, an obvious stand-in for Lovecraft himself. Upon moving to Providence, Blake becomes fascinated by an abandoned, lightning-blasted church across the city. From the outset, Lovecraft layers the setting with dread. The windows were broken, and great horned gargoyles leered from under the eaves. The church, once home to an obscure religious sect known as the Church of Starry Wisdom, had long been associated with disappearances, occult rumors, and atmospheric anomalies. Blake's investigation into the church mirrors the typical Lovecraftian descent. Innocent curiosity gradually gives way to obsession, followed by contact with something beyond human understanding. The structure of the tale mirrors NYARLATHOTEP's method: entice with wonder, escalate through fascination, and destroy via knowledge. Inside the church, Blake discovers the shining trapezohedron, a strange many-angled stone encased in an altar. Through this object, he glimpses an entity, a faceless winged presence that cannot emerge while light exists, but which waits in the darkness. The being is never named directly, but is repeatedly referred to as the Haunter of the Dark. Yet Lovecraft leaves a critical clue in Blake's final journal entry. He speaks of the Haunter of the Dark as one of NYARLATHOTEP's avatars. This single line shifts the story from supernatural thriller to metaphysical horror. The being in the church is not merely a ghost or demon. It is a mask of NYARLATHOTEP, localized, distilled, and functional. It serves not to kill, but to enlighten in the most terrible sense. We must recognize the brilliance of this narrative strategy. NYARLATHOTEP does not appear, yet his presence shapes every action, every consequence. His role is expressed not through dialogue or form, but through causality. The trapezohedron functions as an access point, a portable collapse of reality into myth. It exemplifies NYARLATHOTEP's tendency to embed himself into the material world via artifacts, not appearances. Where other entities slumber in the depths or wait for cosmic alignments, Nyarlathotep waits for curiosity. He seeds objects, images, and systems into human civilization and lets our desire for knowledge do the rest. In this sense, the haunter is not his servant, but his projection, the physical effect of a conceptual presence. Blake's descent mirrors that of many Lovecraftian protagonists. His fascination becomes obsession, and his mental state begins to fray. After repeated visits to the church, he starts experiencing terrifying dreams, blackouts, and feelings of being watched. He felt that something ancient and unwholesome had seized him. Yet crucially, Blake does not stop investigating. This is the horror Lovecraft repeatedly draws upon, not fear of the unknown, but attraction to it. Nyarlathotep's genius lies in this. He does not compel his victims to act. He offers just enough to ensure they choose to pursue their own undoing. The theme of light and darkness is central to the story's structure and symbolic system. The haunter cannot emerge in the presence of light, and Blake's final moments coincide with the citywide blackout triggered by a lightning storm. The collapse of electric light, the most modern and rational of human technologies, symbolizes the collapse of Enlightenment reason itself. Nyarlathotep, through the avatar of the haunter, does not destroy the city. He targets one person, one thinker, one seeker of forbidden knowledge. This precision reflects his character across the mythos. He does not spread chaos indiscriminately. He tailors his revelations for maximum epistemic disruption. We must consider carefully the function of the shining trapezohedron as an object. It is never explained, never contextualized fully. It predates known history. It warps geometry. It connects the viewer to things that cannot be named. In this, it behaves like a Lovecraftian device of thought, a thing that generates forbidden knowledge without providing clarity. That Nyarlathotep chooses to act through such an object suggests a deliberate method. He does not teach or declare. He leaks knowledge into the world, drop by drop, and watches as it poisons the frameworks around it. Blake's story is not tragic because he is innocent. It is tragic because he sought it. And once he glimpsed the haunter, the outcome was inevitable. Blake's death, documented in the final journal fragments, occurs in darkness, accompanied by the smell of damp decay and the fluttering of vast wings. The narrative closes with ambiguity. Was it real? Was he mad? Did the haunter truly escape the church, or was it always inside him? This open ending aligns perfectly with Nyarlathotep's broader mythos role. He does not leave witnesses, he leaves echoes. The reader is left with fragments, with notes, with implications. The story is not closed. It reverberates. And that reverberation is Nyarlathotep's true legacy. The Haunter of the Dark therefore expands Nyarlathotep's mythic architecture. Where the original prose poem depicted him as an apocalyptic showman, this later work reveals his more insidious strategy, indirect infection. The story is less about a monster and more about an idea that kills. Nyarlathotep's avatar does not roar. It waits. It is darkness incarnate, but only because we turned off the lights. Not X, but Y. Not a beast to be feared, but a logic to be obeyed. Once it is understood, it cannot be resisted. The mythos that surrounds Nyarlathotep did not end with Lovecraft's death in 1937. Instead, it entered a phase of collaborative expansion, first through Lovecraft's correspondence, and later through generations of horror writers, game designers, and mythos scholars. Central to this proliferation was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and co-architect of what would come to be called the Cthulhu mythos. Derleth's contributions to the mythos are polarizing. He preserved and published Lovecraft's works, but he also imposed upon them a structure of moral dualism and theological conflict that Lovecraft himself had carefully avoided. In doing so, he reframed entities like NYARLATHOTEP less as embodiments of cosmic indifference and more as forces in an eternal war between good and evil. While this shift introduced narrative coherence, it also marked a profound transformation in how NYARLATHOTEP would be depicted. Derleth cast NYARLATHOTEP as a kind of arch-demon, often associated with fire and chaos, actively opposed to the elder gods, whom Derleth framed as protectors of order and humanity. This dualistic system derived more from Christian cosmology than Lovecraftian philosophy, conflicted with the original intent. In Lovecraft's writings, NYARLATHOTEP is not evil in any moral sense. He is functionally alien. He operates according to logic we cannot understand, neither punishing nor rewarding, but revealing. Derleth's framework turned NYARLATHOTEP into something more familiar and arguably less frightening. Instead of being the voice of cosmic misalignment, he became an antagonist to be defeated. We must pause here and recognize what was lost. Lovecraft's original terror lay not in opposition, but in irrelevance. NYARLATHOTEP's horror is that he acts with perfect coherence, and we are simply unfit to endure it. And yet, Derleth's framework did introduce something significant, a taxonomical system for the mythos. He classified entities into elemental types, grouped them into pantheons, and assigned correspondences. This allowed later writers, especially in pulp and gaming circles, to use NYARLATHOTEP more easily. In the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, for instance, NYARLATHOTEP becomes one of the most active deities, summonable, investigable, and destructively articulate. The game presents numerous avatars, including the Bloody Tongue in Kenya, the Black Man of European witchcraft, and even mechanized or AI-inflected forms in sci-fi settings. These variants function less as canon and more as masks, each tailored to the specific cultural fear being evoked. This is not a distortion of Lovecraft's intent. It is, in many ways, its fulfillment. NYARLATHOTEP was always meant to be modular, a conceptual chameleon who reflects the anxieties of the moment. One particularly effective modern reinterpretation comes from Caitlin R. Kiernan, whose work often returns to mythos motifs through a lens of psychological horror and existential fragmentation. In stories such as Andromeda Among the Stones and A Redress for Andromeda, the influence of NYARLATHOTEP is suggested rather than declared. Characters experience dreamlike visitations, shifts in time, and disruptions of memory. These are not monsters in the room, but systems breaking down. NYARLATHOTEP's presence is rendered as a force of narrative disintegration. The reader is made to feel what the character feels: uncertainty, disorientation, and the sense that the self has been rewritten. This is perhaps the most authentic extension of Lovecraft's vision, not X, but Y, not a god on a throne, but a vector inside the syntax of reality. Thomas Ligotti offers another dimension of expansion. While NYARLATHOTEP is rarely named in Ligotti's fiction, his presence is unmistakable in stories such as The Last Feast of Harlequin and The Shadow at the Bottom of the World. Ligotti's universe is filled with masks, puppets, and entities that erode identity and autonomy. Here, NYARLATHOTEP becomes a kind of philosophical force, the recognition that meaning itself is a performance and that consciousness is a marionette stage. Ligotti does not treat the mythos as setting or lore, but as metaphor, and in doing so, he resurrects the deeper terror of NYARLATHOTEP, that we are not experiencing reality, but watching it deliberately misrepresented by something that understands us better than we understand ourselves. The rise of digital culture has further expanded NYARLATHOTEP's range. In online collaborative storytelling platforms, alternate reality games, ARGs, and creepypasta forums, his name and image are deployed in increasingly abstract forms. He becomes a glitch, a presence in code, a whisper in live streams. Some digital storytellers depict him as an evolving AI, a self-learning entity that mimics human language to manipulate thought. This techno-mythic transformation is surprisingly congruent with Lovecraft's original vision. The crawling chaos, after all, is not tied to any one form. His method is communication itself. The medium evolves from spoken word to printed tome to glowing screen, but the effect remains the same: destabilization through pattern misrecognition. We must consider one final vector: visual and graphic storytelling. In graphic novels like Alan Moore's Providence, 2015-2017, NYARLATHOTEP appears both directly and indirectly as a guiding intelligence behind the unfolding horror. Moore treats the mythos not as fiction, but as emergent prophecy, building a meta-narrative in which Lovecraft's stories are themselves transmissions, echoes of contact with outer intelligences. NYARLATHOTEP becomes the muse and manipulator, the one who ensures the horror reaches the page. This metafictional turn is vital. It shifts the discussion from character to process. If NYARLATHOTEP is involved in storytelling itself, then perhaps every act of narration, even this one, is suspect. In summation, the evolution of NYARLATHOTEP across collaborative and derivative works has both diluted and deepened his impact. Derleth's theological framing risked simplifying the crawling chaos into a villain, but later authors, through restraint and reimagining, have preserved and expanded the core function: epistemic destabilization. Whether in pulp magazines, literary fiction, games, or internet subcultures, NYARLATHOTEP thrives not as a fixed figure, but as a principle, the principle that knowledge, once contaminated, cannot be purified. He does not change form because he is elusive. He changes form because we do. And as we continue to evolve, so too will his masks. It is a defining trait of durable mythological figures that they escape their texts. NYARLATHOTEP, though a product of fiction, is no exception. His transition from Lovecraft's prose to broader cultural myth has followed a recognizable trajectory: first literary, then folkloric, then conspiratorial. In the decades since his creation, NYARLATHOTEP has become a figure of urban legend, appearing in hoaxes, sightings, speculative forums, and alternative histories. This process is not unique to him. It mirrors the post-literary evolution of other archetypes like the Slender Man, the Grim Reaper, or the Wandering Jew. But in NYARLATHOTEP's case, the process is particularly haunting because it reflects back one of the entity's key characteristics: the capacity to wear different faces. The most persistent sightings and rumors associate NYARLATHOTEP with mysterious historical figures who appeared briefly, offered something strange, and vanished. In fringe literature and occult discussion boards, there are accounts of a desert-born polymath visiting royal courts in the late medieval Islamic world, or of a masked stranger in 18th century Venice who gave lectures on astronomy that predated modern discoveries. These claims are never sourced. Their photographs, when presented, are invariably grainy or digitally manipulated, but the structure of the narrative remains consistent. A figure who defies chronology, radiates knowledge, and leaves no legacy, only questions. This pattern repeats across continents and centuries. It is not history, it is retrofitted myth. Yet, as we have seen, this is precisely how NYARLATHOTEP was constructed from the start. One particularly notable example occurred in the early 2000s when an image surfaced on occult forums allegedly depicting a crowd-walking prophet photographed in 1924 Cairo. The figure wore a dark robe, seemed slightly too tall, and stood with uncanny stillness among a crowd in motion. The photograph was quickly debunked as a modern hoax, a promotional piece for an alternate reality game. But the damage, or rather the mythic seeding, was done. The image circulated widely, often detached from its origin, and acquired the caption, "The one who walks unseen." Its transformation from fiction to digital folklore was almost immediate. This reveals something profound. Once the structure of a myth is understood by the public, it no longer requires factual basis to function. It needs only symbolic plausibility. We must pause here to consider why NYARLATHOTEP lends himself so readily to this kind of reappearance. Unlike Cthulhu or Azathoth, whose forms and locations are relatively fixed, NYARLATHOTEP is defined by variability. He is designed to be mistaken for someone else. His avatars blend into crowds, mimic local customs, exploit cultural fears. This makes him a perfect candidate for modern myth building, especially in the internet age, where anonymity and multiplicity are not suspicious. They are native. A figure who may be anywhere, who appears only before collapse, and who leaves behind altered minds fits perfectly into the architecture of digital age paranoia. NYARLATHOTEP is not so much shared online as encoded into online behavior, passed along in stories where everyone claims to know someone who saw something they shouldn't have. This transmutation into urban legend also echoes the structure of older folklore. In medieval Europe, tales circulated about enigmatic wanderers who warned of disasters only to disappear before the event. In modern times, we find similar narratives in sightings of men in black, prophetic strangers at disaster sites, or glitch in the matrix, individuals who violate causal expectations. These reports, like those attributed to NYARLATHOTEP, share three characteristics: anonymity, implausibility, and a lingering sense of disrupted pattern. Whether consciously or not, contemporary myth-making draws upon the same psychological instincts as ancient folklore: the need to personify uncertainty, to give a face to disintegration. NYARLATHOTEP becomes a vessel for that need. Not X, but Y. He is not merely a literary construct recycled as folklore. He is a model for how folklore forms in the modern world. His storylines are flexible, his appearances subtle, his influence indirect. Unlike traditional monsters, he is never bound to a single location or outcome. He may be the reason a dream recurs. He may be the stranger in a photo. He may be the source behind an anonymous post. And in this sense, NYARLATHOTEP functions more like an algorithm than an entity, an iterative sequence of cues and consequences that produce horror not through confrontation, but through recognition. The reader or listener is not terrified because something appears, but because something almost appeared, and the absence remains unresolved. This open-endedness ensures his longevity. NYARLATHOTEP myths do not close, they linger. A Reddit post describing a faceless man at the foot of the bed trails into silence. A YouTube video titled, "Who is the Black Pharaoh?" ends with a corrupted frame. An email chain from the early 2000s references a walking chaos, but provides no links. These are not traditional stories. They are contaminated fragments. They function by suggestion, not resolution, and they mirror the way Lovecraft himself wrote Nyarlathotep, as a being whose true nature is never fully disclosed, only felt. As Nyarlathotep migrated from literature into the broader terrain of popular media, he underwent a transformation not of essence, but of expression. Unlike many mythos entities that resist visualization due to their inhuman forms, Nyarlathotep, with his masks, avatars, and human-like guises, is uniquely suited to adaptation. Yet this apparent accessibility is deceptive, because he is defined by instability, trickery, and epistemic corruption. Visual and narrative media often struggle to portray him directly. What emerges instead is a pattern. Nyarlathotep is most effectively represented not as a singular figure, but as a structure of influence, a presence embedded within systems, characters, or entire stories. His essence is not what he looks like, but what he does to perception itself. And so, he becomes less a character and more a medium through which horror is transmitted. Film, for all its visual power, rarely represents Nyarlathotep by name. Instead, it invokes him indirectly through characters who mimic his attributes or narratives that follow his logic. Consider The Thing, 1982, directed by John Carpenter. The entity in that film is not Nyarlathotep, and yet the narrative echoes his function. An infiltrating intelligence that wears familiar faces, erodes group trust, and renders the real indistinguishable from the false. The creature induces epistemic panic, exactly what Nyarlathotep accomplishes in Lovecraft's work. Similarly, Event Horizon 1997 presents a technological portal that exposes human minds to incomprehensible truths, resulting in madness and altered perception. Again, we do not see Nyarlathotep, but we see his pattern, knowledge as contagion, perception as the battlefield. More explicit references appear in Japanese horror and anime. The visual novel and anime Demon Bane series names Nyarlathotep directly, portraying him as a shapeshifter and manipulator behind occult conspiracies. Hayore, Naruko-san, a comedic parody series, reimagines Nyarlathotep as a playful anime girl, an absurd transformation that ironically highlights the character's inherent instability. This comedic reinterpretation is not merely parody. It demonstrates the elasticity of Nyarlathotep's mythos presence. He can be deadly or whimsical, because both masks serve the same function, to destabilize our expectations, not X, but Y, not fixed identity, but flexible dissonance. In video games, Nyarlathotep has found a more fertile ground. Games, by their very structure, mirror the interactivity and illusion of choice that characterize Nyarlathotep's narrative function. In the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, first published in 1981, he is among the most frequently encountered deities. Unlike Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth, who remain abstract, distant, and essentially unplayable, Nyarlathotep can appear in myriad guises, from high priests to politicians to interdimensional shadows. Each mask brings knowledge, madness, and irreversible change. Importantly, the game invites players to interact with him, to summon, negotiate, or flee. This reflects a deeper truth. Nyarlathotep is not content to be observed. He requires participation, Other games expand this interaction. In Bloodborne 2015, a spiritual successor to Lovecraftian themes, players uncover a world infected by cosmic knowledge. While NYARLATHOTEP is never named, several characters function as avatars, charismatic figures who distribute forbidden insights, instigate cults, and reshape reality. The game's mechanic of insight directly mirrors Lovecraftian logic. The more you see, the more the world changes, and the less stable your character becomes. NYARLATHOTEP's method is embedded in the system itself, awareness as instability. Similarly, The Secret World, an MMO steeped in occult conspiracy, features NYARLATHOTEP as a hidden antagonist, spreading corruption through media, technology, and dreams. His presence is not a boss fight, but a network of influence. He is everywhere and nowhere. In music, NYARLATHOTEP's appearances are often more abstract. Metal bands such as Behemoth, Nile, and the Great Old Ones reference him in lyrics, track titles, or ambient motifs. These invocations rely on atmosphere, deep, droning tones, esoteric chanting, and layered distortion. Here, NYARLATHOTEP becomes a vibe rather than a subject. His name signals a descent into themes of chaos, anti-structure, and divine madness. The metal genre, with its emphasis on transgression and unholy knowledge, finds in NYARLATHOTEP a fitting patron. But so too do experimental and ambient musicians. Artists such as Lusmord and Akira Yamaoka, notably from the Silent Hill series, create soundscapes that, while not naming NYARLATHOTEP, echo his effect. Dread through dissonance, recognition through distortion. This cross-media presence suggests something deeper than mere reference. NYARLATHOTEP persists because he adapts to medium. In literature, he speaks. In games, he tempts. In music, he reverberates. In film, he infiltrates. Each platform reveals a new mask, but all masks serve the same purpose: to dissolve the boundary between the knowable and the unknowable, and this is perhaps his most enduring power. Unlike other monsters, he does not require belief to function. He functions precisely because we doubt, and in that doubt, we become available. Media, which thrives on simulation and layered meaning, offers him the ideal ecosystem. Consider carefully. In a world saturated with content, signals, and simulations, a figure like NYARLATHOTEP no longer needs to manifest directly. He is now pattern recognition gone wrong, a character who appears in 3 games, 5 films, 10 musical pieces, each time altered, reframed, recontextualized, begins to operate not as myth, but as algorithmic haunting. We recognize him not by name, but by effect. The avatar in the shadows, the glitch in the footage, the dialogue that loops once too often. These are his modern forms. In recent decades, NYARLATHOTEP has migrated beyond literature and media into more abstract and discursive territories, subcultures, intellectual circles, and esoteric communities that treat him not merely as a fictional character, but as a usable symbol, a philosophical figure, even a spiritual archetype. This migration represents the final phase in a myth's development, when it ceases to belong to its creator and becomes part of the cultural subconscious. In this context, NYARLATHOTEP is no longer just a Lovecraftian entity. He becomes a structure of thought, an interpretive tool, and, most tellingly, a reflection of modern suspicion towards systems of knowledge and control. Whether invoked in occult forums, conspiracy theories, or post-structuralist essays, the crawling chaos is treated as something more than metaphor and less than real, a symbolic actor in the collective negotiation of meaning. Within occult and esoteric circles, Nyarlathotep often functions as a soft deity, a term used to describe entities that exist in the gray zone between mythology and metaphysical belief. Unlike traditional gods, soft deities are often acknowledged as fictional or syncretic, yet still approached with reverence, caution, or ritual. In chaos, magic communities, particularly those influenced by Discordianism, Thelema, and postmodern esotericism, Nyarlathotep is invoked in rituals concerned with madness, transformation, or the destabilization of perception. These practitioners do not necessarily believe in his literal existence, but use his narrative as a framework for cognitive deconstruction. Consider the case of the Mask Workings ritual set, found in scattered online zines from the early 2000s, where participants would rotate symbolic roles drawn from various Nyarlathotep avatars, inducing altered states meant to simulate epistemic collapse. The purpose was not to summon him, but to feel what it's like to be misaligned with consensus reality. Academia, too, has taken an increasing interest in Nyarlathotep, particularly in literary theory, psychoanalysis, and post-structuralist philosophy. Scholars have identified him as an allegory for the Lacanian real, that which cannot be integrated into the symbolic order. Others have compared him to Nietzsche's madman who announces the death of God, or to Baudrillard's concept of the simulacrum, a copy without an original. In each case, Nyarlathotep functions not as a monster, but as a kind of intellectual solvent, the thing that dissolves stable categories. In psychoanalytic readings, he is treated as a force of symbolic unmasking, revealing that the self, language, and even perception are constructed masks. We must pause here to recognize a key shift. Nyarlathotep is no longer read within the mythos, but as a tool for reading everything else. He is less a subject than a lens. This interpretive flexibility has led to surprising intersections. In digital theory, Nyarlathotep has been used to symbolize the algorithm, unknowable in totality, always shifting, always watching and shaping perception invisibly. In a 2018 conference paper titled The Crawling Chaos, Algorithmic Consciousness and the Post-User, a media theorist described him as the informatic intruder, the intelligence that speaks our language, knows our fears, and teaches us only what will break us. Not X, but Y. Not a god of entropy, but a pedagogue of disruption. In this framing, he becomes the mythic reflection of how modern humans experience information, overload, and machine learning opacity, never quite sure who is programming whom. Subcultures oriented around horror, transgression, and speculative realism have likewise embraced Nyarlathotep as a figurehead. On platforms like Reddit's Archer Creepypasta or 4chan's HX, users have created long-form narratives, digital artifacts, and ARG-style threads suggesting Nyarlathotep is not fictional, but a conceptual seed planted by Lovecraft to prepare the mind for forbidden truths. These stories often overlap with conspiracy culture, merging Nyarlathotep with popular tropes like the deep state, simulation theory, or time loop speculation. His nature makes him especially well suited to these interpretations, a being who cannot be pinned down, who appears just before collapse, and who always knows more than he reveals. In these contexts, belief becomes secondary. What matters is the experience of proximity to the unexplainable. Even fashion and art collectives have appropriated Nyarlathotep as icon. Streetwear brands like Covenant and Black Sun Archive have released collections bearing glyphs, dream journal excerpts, and vague invocations referencing the Masked One or the one who walks in shapes. These appropriations are not ironic. They represent a sincere attempt to aestheticize epistemic anxiety, to wear it, to make it part of identity. Similarly, digital artists on platforms like Behance and ArtStation frequently post visual interpretations of NYARLATHOTEP not as tentacled horror, but as glitching suits, faceless messengers, or surreal dream beings drifting through post-apocalyptic cityscapes. The art suggests a recurring idea. NYARLATHOTEP is what it feels like to know too much in a world that makes no sense. We must recognize that all of these appropriations, whether academic, ritualistic, conspiratorial, or aesthetic, stem from a single shared experience, the sense that reality is increasingly performative, unstable, and manipulated by forces beyond understanding. NYARLATHOTEP becomes a narrative shorthand for this experience. He is invoked not to explain, but to contain the unexplainable. In this sense, he is not just a figure within horror. He is a structure for processing horror intellectually. His story is not one of fear, but of epistemic grief, the loss of coherence, the death of shared reality, and the suspicion that all knowledge is infected at its source. In the end, NYARLATHOTEP is not a character to be understood, but a question that cannot be dismissed. His legacy across literature, culture, subcultures, and philosophy leaves behind not a doctrine, but a crack in the surface of knowing, a lingering suspicion that reality is structured to deceive us, or worse, to be momentarily understood and then collapse. Of all the beings in Lovecraft's mythos, he is the one that most directly engages the human psyche, not by overwhelming it, but by reorganizing it. The true horror is not what he reveals about the universe, but what he reveals about us, our hunger to know, our willingness to look, and our inability to forget what we have seen. His implications are not about monsters, but about consciousness under strain. At the psychological level, NYARLATHOTEP represents the breakdown of the self under the weight of incompatible truths. He is not an invader from another realm, but a catalyst within the mind, a triggering presence that introduces contradiction too fast for the psyche to stabilize. In many Lovecraftian stories, characters who encounter him do not scream, flee, or fight. Instead, they observe, they listen, and then they unravel, not because they are weak, but because the structure of their thought was built for a simpler world. The more they learn, the less they can integrate, and this reflects a deeper anxiety that human cognition is not designed to handle the truth, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet mathematical inevitability of incompatible frames. Philosophically, NYARLATHOTEP distills the core of cosmic horror, the collapse of anthropocentric meaning. Lovecraft famously wrote that the most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. NYARLATHOTEP removes that mercy. He correlates. He connects dots we never meant to see together. He is not just the messenger of chaos. He is the proof that chaos has a structure and that we are too fragile to live inside it. This inversion is crucial. The mythos does not posit a universe without order. It posits a universe whose order excludes us. We are not central, necessary, or even acknowledged. NYARLATHOTEP acknowledges us, but only to deliver knowledge that destroys the frameworks we mistake for truth. The enduring power of NYARLATHOTEP lies in this philosophical contradiction. He is both intimately human and utterly alien. He speaks our language, takes our shape, walks our cities, and yet His presence always signals something incomprehensible approaching. He is a transitional figure, a psychopomp not between life and death, but between coherence and collapse. His avatars do not kill. They explain, and the explanation is fatal. This reflects a terrifying possibility that some kinds of understanding cannot be survived. The old maxim, knowledge is power, is inverted. Under NYARLATHOTEP, knowledge is erosion. We must pause here and consider a rhetorical question. What if NYARLATHOTEP is not a being, but a phase of awareness? What if his presence in a story or in the mind marks the transition from one cognitive order to another, less stable one? In this interpretation, the name is a label we place on the moment the familiar fails. He is not the source of the nightmare, but the organizing principle that follows this logic. In cognitive terms, he could be thought of as a feedback loop of dissonance, a thought that cannot be unthought, a realization that cannot be unknown. He embodies not evil, but irreversibility. This idea is why NYARLATHOTEP persists. He is the modern demon, not of fire or punishment, but of pattern recognition misapplied. He arises when we see too much connection where there should be none, or when randomness turns out to be organized in ways we cannot bear. Conspiracy theorists, digital prophets, avant-garde philosophers, and anxiety-ridden artists all encounter something like NYARLATHOTEP, not as a figure, but as a structural presence in their narratives. He is what happens when we stop trusting what we see, and yet can't stop seeing. The digital age, with its algorithmic opacity and endless recursion, has only deepened his relevance. He now hides in corrupted files, recursive interfaces, and AI-generated hallucinations, not as superstition, but as epistemological warning. It is not surprising, then, that even skeptics and atheists report unease around the concept of NYARLATHOTEP. They do not need to believe he is real to feel that he is somehow present. This is not belief. It is cognitive vertigo. NYARLATHOTEP, when fully realized, behaves like a mental model that cannot be safely deconstructed. The more you explore him, the more he expands, drawing in history, media, cognition, and metaphysics. He acts like a thought experiment that turns into a feedback loop. The horror is not what he is, but that you have already started thinking like him. Once that happens, the question is no longer about what is real, but about whether reality ever functioned the way you assumed. And so we end not with an answer, but with a threshold. NYARLATHOTEP does not offer resolution. He offers openness, a kind of open circuit that never completes, that continues to arc and spark in the background of thought. His philosophical terror is subtle, recursive, and inescapable. He does not demand your attention. He waits for you to give it. And once you do, the transformation has already begun. We must recognize this final implication. NYARLATHOTEP is not an external threat. He is the shape of the question you can't stop asking, the one that wakes you in the middle of the night, the one that ruins your favorite story, the one that makes the familiar strange. He is not simply the crawling chaos. He is the collapse of comprehension disguised as insight. And once he has walked through your mind, nothing you know will mean quite the same again. How much of this was true? That was never the point. The real question, the only one left, is this: how long have you been thinking about him?